Hi there, welcome to FinAg. This tutorial is to provide you with an overview of the chart section of the site. The objective of this page is to allow you to visualize financial filing data in a way that is as simple as possible. So let's dive in. The basic idea of its design is that first on the left you must query for the data of interest, and then at the top you must set how you like to view it. On the left side, we have controls here on how to filter. We can add entities by ticker, by sector, and we can filter out entities that don't meet certain constraint requirements. If you're only interested in viewing select entities, feel free to enter in their ticker and hit add. If you're only interested in viewing select sectors, you can check them off here. For convenience, there are two buttons that allow you to select all and clear all. Finally, if you're interested in filtering out any entities that you added by some measure, we allow you to set constraints, up to 4 at a time. The info to set includes the financial measure of interest, the period at which the value occurred, and the min-max values. It pays to familiarize yourself with this dropdown because it's also used in the charting section of the site. It includes a lot of line items, but they're categorized by market value line items coming from the income statement, from the balance sheet, from the cash flow statement, and various ratios having to do with valuation, profitability, liquidity, credit, leverage, and performance. Also know that the line items have parentheses after them to tell you how they are denominated. Line items denominated in dollars will be denominated in millions of dollars. Then there's percentage, which is expressed as decimals when entering in values. And then there are multiples. So keep that in mind as you're entering in the values here. So for example, if I was interested in looking for companies over $1 billion for the current period, I would type in 1,000 min. Similarly, if I was interested in looking for companies growing at over 10% a year in the current period, I would type in 0.10. But the homepage has a filter already. It's looking for revenue of companies over $50 billion. But most of the time, you're going to want to look at all companies at the same time. So I recommend hitting reset, gets rid of all the filters, selects all the sectors, and then you can hit filter. The data is now ready for viewing. Let's talk about visualization now. There are two major chart types: time series and distribution. Just a reminder of chart basics. Time series is how data is trending across time, and distribution shows you how data lies at a single snapshot in time. If you were to select your chart type as time series, you'll notice 4 pairs of drop downs, and these represent the lines you can add to a chart to a maximum of 4 at a time. The drop downs include the measure of interest, which are the same measures that were mentioned in the constraint section, and the entities of interest. This dropdown offers a lot. It includes different roll-ups as well as the individual tickers. You can choose to aggregate all your companies and look at the total sum of net income from this example, the average net income in this example, or the median. Same thing by sectors. And this has to do with all the data that you selected. So if you didn't select all the data, for example, the aggregations would only include your subset of data. And then, of course, all the many tickers. Okay, so let's do an example here. Let's look at average revenue of all companies versus manufacturing companies versus the manufacturer of Boeing. So revenue, we'll do average. We'll do revenue average for manufacturing, and we'll look at revenue again for Boeing. Use your keyboard to traverse the menu items faster. Then you hit generate chart to refresh the chart. Now you'll see here that Boeing, by far, has a higher average revenue than the typical manufacturing company or typical company in general. The charts do have some interactivity to it. So the time series, you can see the values if you hover over. And also there are options down here to save the chart. Now let's do another example. Let's compare Apple metrics, revenue of Apple, net income, and we'll look at its valuation of price to earnings. So we select our drop downs, tapping A to traverse. And this is interesting because 2 of our measures are dollar values, and the third one is a multiple value. So in this case, there are 2 y-axes where dollars will be on the left, and the green, the price to earnings ratio, is on the right. Okay, next let's look at distributions. Now, distributions are different than time series because there's a lot more to look at besides just what is typically a time series. There's a lot of different charts. There's pie charts, there's bar charts, there's scatter plots, and there's multi-dimensional projections, which I'll show you. We'll go through all of them. But up front, what I want to say is that the menu items have slightly changed. We still have the line item measures as before, but we have our first and only categorical measure. The rest previously are all numerical. So what is a categorical measure? It's something where the values just don't have greater than or less than relationships to each other. Manufacturing, isn't greater than finance or vice versa. It's just different, right? So what do you do with categorical data? You're typically looking at, proportions of things, or, it helps color your charts. Our second menu here is now periods. What quarter are you interested in viewing the data at? Because we can view all the companies at the same time. So we're concerned about the period. Notice that it changes between time series. It says select entity. If you select it to distribution, it says select period. Let's run through some charts. Let's look at one categorical measure by itself, sector. We just hit generate chart. The best way to view this data is a pie chart. Pie chart, nothing really special here. There's some interactivity to it. It's just really showing you the proportion split between sectors by count. Okay, pretty simple. Now let's do one simple single numerical measure. We'll do market cap. And this is what they call a density chart. Now, a density chart is your one value, market cap, one measure. The y-axis is the count of companies that lie on that number line, okay? So what can we learn about this? Very few companies are on the magnitude of tens of billions of dollars in market cap. Most of them are very small and increasingly small as you go down. We're looking at a lot of entities here. Most people never heard of all these small little public companies, but there are a lot of them, and they're only really worth a few $100 million. Also know that some of the charts have printouts up top to help you understand what you're looking at or give you little caveats. For all the density charts, we trimmed off the lowest 3% and the highest 3% of values. Why did we do that? It helps with the visualization. Okay, so we looked at one variable of each, categorical and numerical. Now let's look at two at a time. So we'll look at sector or categorical and look at market cap again. So if we look at this mix of variables, we get bar charts. And bar charts, the x-axis, they don't really mean anything. It's really just grouping by sector, as you can see by the legend here. And the y values are the average market caps by sector. Okay, so let's look at two numerical. We'll do something that maybe has a linear relationship. So we'll do revenue and net income. Okay, now we got scatter plots here. Scatter plots are pretty cool. Some things to know is that there's a lot of really nice interactivity with the charts with scatter plots. You can hover over to see, hey, what is that ticker right there, and see its values. You can also hold down your mouse to pan around, to traverse the space. You can use your mouse wheel to zoom out, zoom in on dense spaces and see the spread. And what can we learn about scatter plots? Well, you look at something called joint distribution. So on average, you would probably expect companies that make a lot of revenue to generate a lot of net income. Maybe not all the time, but on average, yes. So do we see a linear relationship that expresses that? Kind of. Yeah, it's not perfect. It's pretty messy, but such is life. But it is something that is apparent, and we can now tuck away in our knowledge base and know about the market as we think about markets. So that's a scatter plot. Now, we can add a third measure here, categorical sector. What it'll do is color the chart. You'll notice big plots here. So the little plots were companies. The big plots are sector medians. Okay, so it just lets you know where the sectors lie. So what can we know now that we introduce color? Well, it looks like a lot of yellows up here, up top. So that's finance. So that goes to show that, companies with relatively low revenues, but relatively high net incomes, or AKA high profit margins, could be finance related. So that's interesting. Okay, so now let's look at we were looking at three measures before. Let's look at three numerical measures. So we'll do revenue, we'll do net income, we'll do cash balances. Okay, so this is a little bit complicated and warrants discussion. It's a projected hyperdimensional space on a 2D plot. It's called principal component analysis. And there is some documentation that kind of explains this really well that I wrote. But basically, what you're doing is you're taking a hyperdimensional space that a human kind of can't visualize, and forcing it down to be projected on a 2D plane for viewing. Okay, so as you can imagine, this is a complex object. Forcing it down onto 2D, you won't be able to see all the quote unquote information, but you'll be able to see it. How much information is lost? Not too much, because part of principal component analysis is that it kind of like rotates the object in the best way possible before it projects down. So you can see most of the information. The printout up top will always say how much variance is shown by these two axes. So it's 88% of the information is present. You lost, a little less than 12. How do you understand this chart? The x-axis and y-axis, let's just say that they're meaningless here. Unless you're a statistician, it's hard to explain. But otherwise, your axes that you selected are three axes, originate out of the center and spread out. Cash balances, that's what the green one is here. So if you go in the direction of the arrow, that is an increasing value of that measure. So companies up here theoretically have high cash balances. It's not perfect because again, it's a projection, but on average, yes, it works out that way. Also to know is that the directions of the arrows matter, not in their absolute sense, but in their relative sense. So we have revenue and net income down here. They seem pretty parallel, right? That means that companies that generally have high revenues have high net incomes and vice versa. They have a linear relationship like we saw in the scatter plot. So that's why they're kind of, but not perfectly parallel. If you were to see two arrows going in relatively opposite directions, that means they're negatively correlated. That is very interesting information. Now, if you were to see how cash is rather perpendicular, that means it's kind of indifferent to the changing values of these axes. So perpendicular shapes mean pretty much no correlation. So what does that mean? That means companies that let's say generate high revenues or high net income may not necessarily have high cash balances. Maybe that's even less of the case. Maybe it's these smaller companies that need the greater cash cushions to some extent. Interesting questions. So how can you find interesting entities on a chart like this? Well, think about the area and think about what combination of values may mean. So if we're interested in companies that generate high net income and high revenue, we would go this direction. But if we also demanded that they have high cash balances, we would have to kind of go share a direction between all these arrows. That would be this way. So companies like this, on average, in this direction, have high cash balances, high net income, and high revenues. You can see there's not too many of them, but there are some. So that's the process of filtering. If you were to add another variable here, it would just add a fourth arrow. But if you add sector, it colors it yet again. So coloring is nice. So that pretty much concludes most of the major chart functions. As you can see here, there's a lot of information to browse. I encourage you to just spend time poking around, learning about the market, different ways to view it. It'll help you learn and understand relationships that you may not have expected, spot interesting outliers that other people really aren't seeing. So it's a great way to learn and conduct research, and good luck, and I hope you enjoy this site. Thank you very much.